Philosophers. How's it going? Today we're talking about John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is a very famous philosopher, and we are particularly interested today in talking about Mill's ethics, John Stuart Mill's ethical theory. His last name is just Mill, Millljs, Mill, John Stuart Mill. Sometimes, for whatever reason, people refer to him as Mills. There's no S at the end of his name. It's just John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is very, very well known for being a utilitarian, for being a proponent of an ethical position known as utilitarianism. He is not the first utilitarian, nor is he the last utilitarian. There was a fellow named Henry Sidgwick and another fellow named Jeremy Bentham who were contemporaries of Mill, and there are contemporaries of ours who are also utilitarians. Peter Singer is perhaps amongst the most well-known contemporary utilitarians, and Peter Singer is famous or very well-known for applying the philosophy of utilitarianism to contemporary issues such as famine, poverty, animal rights, and stuff like that. So utilitarianism is a very easy theory to apply to, easy conceptually at least, to apply to contemporary moral issues such as poverty, famine, animal rights, etc. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory which falls into a category known as teleological, Teleological. It's a teleological theory. Another word that's very similar to teleological is consequentialism. 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 Telos, the word where teleology comes from, Telos, is the Greek word for end or purpose. What is your telos? What's your end or purpose? And similarly, parallelly, the word consequentialism, the word consequence is at the root of the word consequentialism. This is because teleological theories or consequentialist theories are theories which believe or deem or assert that the rightness or wrongness of a particular action is based on an assessment of that action's consequences or its end, right? Perhaps you remember one of the before you read questions asked about the chain of events, that every sort of ethical choice has a motivation, an action, and a consequence. I think the example was something like you want to pass your philosophy class, that's your motivation, so you cheat on the test, that's your action, and then there was a consequence that you failed the test or passed the test or got caught or didn't get caught. Ethical theories that are teleological or ethical theories that are consequentialist, like utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill's ethical theory. Ethical theories such as this determine the rightness or wrongness of that ethical chain based on the consequences. So in the example that we just thought about, the cheating on the test, consequentialists or teleologists don't care why you cheat on the test. They don't even care that you cheated on the test. They simply care about what happened as a result, as the consequent of cheating on the test. And if those consequences were positive, the action was sort of retroactively deemed as being morally correct. And if those consequences were negative, the action was deemed sort of retroactively as being immoral. So a teleological or consequentialist theory is a theory which determines an action's rightness or wrongness based on an assessment of the consequences of the action. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist teleological theory, and the consequences that utilitarianism are interested in are the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So utilitarians, including John Stuart Mill, believe that what makes an action right or an action is morally correct to the extent that that action results in an increase of happiness for the greatest number of people. So Mill's system, known as utilitarianism, is a consequentialist system because the rightness or wrongness depends on the consequences. And Mill's system is based on what's called the principle of utility. This is the very first sentence of our article. It says the creed which accepts utility as the foundation of morals or the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So literally, Mill is saying actions are morally correct insofar as that action produces or results in an increase of happiness for the greatest number of people. That is what the principle of utility states. He then goes on to tell us what happiness is, and he says, by happiness, I intend pleasure and the absence of pain, and by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So for Mill, happiness is defined as pleasure. Now, he means a little bit more than this than we might think. He doesn't mean, all right, let's go and, I don't know, what gives you pleasure? Watch, bad movies and eat Swedish fish and, stay up all night playing Grand Theft Auto or whatever it's called. So not so simple for multiple reasons. So first of all, utilitarianism, not interested in the agent's own happiness. The agent is the person performing the ethical act. So it's not simply the agent's own happiness. It's the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So for utilitarianism, it is not enough that the action increase my happiness and perhaps result in your sadness. It's altogether what makes an action morally correct is that it increases happiness for the greatest number of people. It might even decrease my own happiness. But if it increases, if the net increase in happiness for the greatest number of people is better, even if my happiness goes down, that is what makes something morally correct. So let's go back to this notion of pleasure. So pleasure for Mill is going to be mostly pleasures of the mind. Mill is going to make a distinction between bodily pleasures, physical pleasures, and intellectual pleasures, or pleasures of the mind. And Mill is going to suggest that the most happiness, the best happiness, the happiness for the greatest number of people can be achieved by and large more effectively by pursuing pleasures of the mind, pleasures of the intellect, what he'll call higher pleasures, over bodily pleasures. And this is where we come upon what's really somewhat of a famous quote. It appears in our article on page 600, where he says, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." So what does he mean by this? He means that because human beings have an intellect, because human beings can experience what he calls higher pleasures, which are pleasures of the mind, he would rather be a human being dissatisfied than Socrates, right? Dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. Why is this? Because he believes, right, one of the questions on your before you read was, would you rather be something like a super happy animal or a relatively unhappy, unsatisfied human being? Some days I have a dog. You've probably seen her jumping at the back windows in some of these videos. And many days she seems like she's got it quite good, right? I leave for work, I'm doing schoolwork, I'm stressed out. And what is my dog doing? Oh, she's barking at the squirrels. She's sleeping on her bed at the front window. She's, chasing her tail, eating a bone. She seems quite happy, actually. And some days I discuss with her, how about you stay here and how about I stay here and look out the window and you can go to work and, teach class. Mill thinks that would be mistaken. Mill believes that even on an animal's happiest day, they can only get to about here. And human pleasure, because of our ability and capacities of the intellect, can far transcend the happiness of an animal. So Mill says, I would rather be a human being dissatisfied, Socrates dissatisfied, than a fool satisfied. This is because of our potential of the mind. Now, why does Mill think that mental pleasures are better than physical pleasures? Well, there's a few reasons. One of the set of the reasons sounds relatively arrogant to me, and the other set makes sense. So the arrogant bit is where he says, look, if you ask qualified people who've tried both kinds of pleasures, those who are in a position to actually know would pick pleasures of the mind. Okay, Mill, right? Mill, you need to know, was like a child genius kind of a person. I can't remember so well all of the details, but, he was like reading Latin when he was 5 or something like that and studying Greek. And, he was a member of parliament. I mean, he's a really super like highbrow smart guy. So, of course, that's what he's going to say, right? Right. So he says... this is on page 599 on the left-hand side. He says, the paragraph begins, if I'm asked what I mean by difference of quality. He says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all, or almost all, who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable. So he says, those who are completely acquainted with both would pick this one. Next paragraph down, he says, now it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. So basically he's saying, look, all of my smart, highbrow, intellectual friends, who've drinking Jägermeister and eaten Oreo cookies, and who have attended the symphony and poetry reading and philosophical discussions, they all pick the intellectual poetry reading philosophical discussions over the Jägermeister and Oreo cookies. So obviously, if all those people are picking it, then it must be better. Okay, Mill. Now, his other set of reasons for saying that pleasures of the mind are preferable to pleasures of the body, I actually think are more objectively accessibly accurate. For example, if you think about the duration, how long the pleasure can last. If you compare physical pleasures to bodily or physical pleasures to pleasures of the mind or intellectual pleasures, it is in fact the case that pleasures of the mind can last longer. I could be eating a package of Oreo cookies. The actual pleasure of the Oreo cookies, the pleasure I'm deriving for the Oreo cookies, really only lasts as long as I'm actually eating the Oreo cookie. Once the ingestion ceases, really the pleasure ceases, and in fact is probably followed by pain, right? Oh my God, why did I eat all those Oreo cookies? I have a stomachache. Where intellectual pleasures or pleasures of the mind are not like that. I can have read a great book or attended a wonderful discussion And I can recount that book or recount that discussion in my head over and over again and still get the same pleasure, if not more pleasure from it, as I sort of recapitulated in my mind. So Mills suggests, and I'm inclined to agree, that intellectual pleasures, pleasures of the mind, have the potential to last longer. Their duration is far greater than pleasures of the body. Other pleasures of the body, I'm not sure what what might come to mind. Sex or exercise or good food. Again, these pleasures to a large extent only last while they are actually happening versus intellectual pleasures or pleasures of the mind, since they only ever existed here in the first place, can continue on. Another reason is that pleasures of the mind have the ability to affect a greater number of people. Remember, this is utilitarianism. It's not just my own happiness, it's the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Pleasures of the body can only bring pleasure to those bodies that are experiencing it. If I have a package of Oreo cookies with 25 cookies, 25 people can get pleasure from that. But pleasures of the mind have the ability to affect a greater number of people because their commodity is not runnable, outable, right? You don't just eat the 25 Oreo cookies and you're done. A pleasure of the mind can apply to a greater number of people. So Mill thinks that this is another reason that pleasures of the mind are better than pleasures of the body. So they last longer and they appeal to more people. These are two big reasons why utilitarians, for the most part, prefer bodily pleasures less than pleasures of the mind. So let's just think for a few minutes here about how utilitarianism is then applied in making actual ethical or moral decisions. So because utilitarianism believes that what makes an action morally correct is the extent to which it increases happiness for the greatest number of people, in order for me to decide if an action is in fact morally correct or which action is better, my duty, if you will, as a utilitarian, my charge as a moral agent, right? Someone making moral choices, which we all do every day. My duty is to perform those actions, and only those actions, which result in an increase of happiness for the greatest number of people. So this might mean I might need to forego my own happiness, but for utilitarianism, and this is an important point, this is actually what got animals involved in the game here, is any sentient being, any creature that can experience pleasure or pain counts in the tallying up of did this action result in an increase or decrease of happiness. So because of that, things like factory farming, which I would suggest result in a tremendous amount of pain and suffering in a tremendously high number of sentient creatures. Factory farming on a utilitarian standard might be deemed immoral, shocking as that may seem, because it results in a significant decrease in happiness for a great number of people. But what I think you might quickly realize is that it's very difficult to actually assess how much happiness or unhappiness a particular action results in. How do I know how much happiness? Do I count? Does everybody raise their hand? Are they happier or unhappier? And happiness when? I might have immediate happiness from a particular action, but then later down the line, that happiness decreases. So at what point do I assess the happiness? Nevertheless, if you think about your choices and your actions, and you want to be a good utilitarian, the charge for you is to perform only those actions which result in an increase of happiness for the greatest number of people. And by happiness, we mean pleasure and the absence of pain, and we mean preferably intellectual pleasures, pleasures of the mind, pleasures of the intellect versus pleasures of the body. So in a nutshell, that's utilitarianism. We will be looking at other ethical theories and then wrap all of this up in thinking about some examples of how these ethical theories would suggest we behave in particular circumstances. So I hope this was helpful and interesting. I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll talk to you again soon.